All right. So, introducing Natalie Kilber about quantum and the threat inflation. Take it away, Natalie. Give her a hands.
Thank you for letting me be here, and I upfront apologize if I have to cough a lot. I'm probably a bigger hazard being somewhere on site, so I apologize for once this now for German efficiency, and I'll start right away. Thank you for having me. Can you see my screen? Perfect. So I'll jump right through it. My title is Quantum Threat Inflation, Riding the Cyber Wave. What I mean with it is that the quantum threat is rarely challenged, and too often storylines are accepted at face value. And between the objective, the actual quantum threat, and the inflation of it, like most complex subjects, the truth often falls in the middle of two extremes. And especially because the threat is situated and based on advancements in fundamental research, this one is skewed towards the inflation of it. But don't take my word for it. Let's assess it together. In the spirit of, sorry, something's laggy. Can you see it? In the spirit of Feynman. As he said, I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. First, I'll introduce some basic QT concepts, so quantum technology concepts, so everyone has the prerequisites in their own hands to assess a risk themselves. We move over to the premise behind the quantum threat, and lastly, what do attacks from quantum computers really mean? We'll look at the topic with nested-proof PQC algorithm standards, attack vectors, and we will look at risk ratings. So why do we have quantum computers and what makes them so different? Here you can see an IBM 2 nanometer nanosheet that they will fabricate in 2023. And that means we're insatiable for more compute power. We want to play Doom in VR for hours. We want to fit in more. We need to go smaller. So we can play Doom on fridges, for example. So what you see is the transistor nanosheet FET, and grossly exaggerated. Many of them make registers. So many make registers. And these only know two states. An electron soup has a voltage applied or not, so they're either on or off. And I'm borrowing Feynman's analogy here of the dumb file clerk for a computer. You can see the talk on YouTube. It's nice if you want to look it up. It's also really funny. What it conveys is that the computer doesn't register anything between on or off and needs precise instructions to do anything. So meet Jen from the IT crowd. She doesn't know how she ended up in the IT department. She needs clear instructions to do anything. She is my file clerk for now. So as I said, we need to go smaller to fit in more. And then there's a natural limit, a literal physical limit, how small you can go. And I mean, sub-nanometer size, not just 2 nanometer. So down to single electrons, then we're confronted with quantum phenomena. And for an example, a single electron transistor is actually a quantum dot and already a qubit. What you see here on the slide is also an IBM machine. It's an IBM qubit layout of 7 qubits. These are spin qubits. How you usually depict them is like this, with a Bloch sphere. And what you can see here is like these little stickies should represent the spin. And you want to manipulate the electric, they want to manipulate the electric charge. But when we actually think about it, there's other types of hardware as well. It's not just superconducting qubits like IBM. We, for example, have also ion traps from AQT, photonic ones from Xanadu, or neutral atoms from QEra. But down to its core, what I want to convey is, think of it as a Pokemon. Within the Bloch sphere is a Pokeball, and a qubit is a Pokemon. It has exotic properties. It's not just on or off. The 3 main characteristics and main properties for quantum computers or qubits in itself, the building blocks similar to transistors, are superposition, entanglement, and interference. And you can think of it as superposition is a Pokemon that is somersaulting. So it's jumping in the air and is rolling up and down. If it comes down on heads or tail, there's a measurement, so it's either heads or tail, or you can think of a coin if you don't like a Pokemon. But while it is in the air, it's constantly spinning, similar how the point in the Bloch sphere is. So that's superposition. As it's not heads or tails, it's permanently spinning, so it's both at the same time, both states at the same time. Then there's interference, that means amplitudes can get amplified or cancelled, similar like you see in waves. And of course, there's entanglement. That's a more tricky one. Think of a Pokemon or two Pokeballs where the Pokemon inside behave like one because they have telepathy. I have to go back. So these can have multiple states. Quantum operations are, for example, rotations on this Bloch sphere, so flipping it up or down. And in quantum operations, or an operation on this qubit would be, for example, entangle it, so do the Pokemon telepathy. And these are quite literally complex, as a Bloch sphere also looks at complex numbers, but all you need to know is that this Pokemon has special properties. As you can see up here, there's a lot of matrix notation, and if you have more Pokemons entangled, the matrix gets bigger and it's easier to do more complex computations with less entities than with registers. This is a bit complicated. Again, think of it as a Pokemon that has these three special properties: superposition, entanglement, and interference, and it's not just on or off. So what I want you to think about is that our file clerk Jen now has a Pokemon. And on top of all of that, it's not so obedient because it has a lot of noise. So let's just think of it as it had not enough training, so sometimes it stumbles. As in, quantum computers are merely coprocessors, and as such, they depend on traditional computer environments to host them. That's where Gen comes in. So we still have Gen, we have the classical on or off components, and the quantum computer in itself. So down here where the Pikachu is, it's not Turing complete. So at best, a quantum computer is an accelerator that needs this host CPU, and we are in the fundamental research stage. What is also missing is QRAM. What we have with QPUs is quantum read-only memory. So there's no memory to load other than just into these qubits. But there's research being done about QRAM, so quantum random access memory. So there we have some storage. There are breakthroughs in material research at AWS and Harvard just weeks ago that they achieved accuracy of 50%, but that's, again, great for fundamental research that we found a material, but it's not reliable if something stores just 50-50. I talked about the noise and that Pikachu is not well trained. So what I mean with it is that we have error rates, and we look at fidelity at the same time. We have long clock times, and every hardware has some type of noise. And there's environmental factors that we can't eliminate. That means that one logical qubit and a lot of algorithmic computations, they talk about logical qubits, so an error-corrected one. And with these logical qubits, these have an overhead. We read about research advancements in physical qubits, so these many qubits they have achieved to put on a chip, but to do meaningful computation, you need one logical qubit that constitutes of a lot of physical ones. For an example, AQT came up with a color code where they have 7 ion trap qubits making one logical qubit. It was a huge breakthrough. And then I want to talk about what these noisy things are, the characteristics of NISQs, so noisy intermediate scale quantum computers. are noisy because the error rate is so high. And I'm looking at, I'll show you a graph from a good paper that I'll reference soon. We're looking at 6 qubits, and you can see the error rate compounds over time, over qubits, and over how many gates you use. So how many rotations on the sphere you have. Think of it as Pikachu doesn't know how to do the attacks well. It stumbles while it tries to do tackling, especially if it has to do many attacks sequentially. And I talked about fidelity. Gate fidelity is how close two gates are to each other, so how noisy a quantum gate is, so one operation that you do, be it in classical terms a NOT or C NOT, yeah, that suffices. It should be reliably 1. Same paper, due to the current hardware technology limitations, those physical gates, so the physical implementation of the real quantum device, they don't necessarily map to the implemented logical gates. So sound research is being done with proper calibration, proper testing, device classification for certain gates and for the specific qubit layouts to have better fidelities. And you want to have a fidelity of 1 best case. Think of it as Pikachu is not listening. Yeah, not really. Perfect. Partially because of the noise, he stumbles, and think of it also, we don't give clear instructions to the Pikachu. This is the paper that I've been showing you excerpts from. If you want to read up on it, please do. Then I want to talk about the performance metrics. I glossed a little bit over it. These are pushed by witty schemes in calibration and error correction to reduce the noise, but we are far from standardized reliability, and would love to see more focus on this, because we focus on the algorithms and something that could be achieved if there is enough hardware, but there is little in the media about how they're pushing the engineering part of it, that the actual reliability of them gets pushed, not, hey, we're using some noisy stuff, we have some variational quantum algorithm, so we can use this noisy stuff right now. And one of the examples is, for example, quantum supremacy, that it's an artificial scientific goal, and Google claimed it, that it achieved not too long ago. It's the moment a quantum computer has better answers or is more efficiently at answering some questions than a classical one of classical bits. It's only possible because a quantum computer uses these quantum principles, these 3 properties of superposition, entanglement, interference, to do these computations. So we don't have 1 or 0 instead. It's not comparable to anything in the industry like ML, so machine learning algorithm benchmarks. It has no impact on usability and doesn't replace classical counterparts with it. While this one artificial benchmark, quantum supremacy, is largely meant as a scientific benchmark, and it is sound for science, for the science community. Some analysts have co-opted the term, and they pushed it as a national security goal, inflated it, that absolute security can only be achieved with quantum, for example, and that is misinformation. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say about the benchmarks. Enough of the concepts. Now let's get to the premise. We have been bombarded by the news with this or this, that too. And in contrast to that, oh yeah, that one is great too. Funny too, because Y2K, I don't know anyone who actually had an impact with Y2K. But this is my favorite one. This is actually in contrast to the influencer outlets and the media outlets. This paper is from Jay Tibbetts. He got an award for this. And his last line is that quantum computing for some believers pose an existential threat to secrecy. In reality, these threats of quantum computing are very manageable. So how do these inconsistencies between policy concerns and technical realities come about? What is the gap between these statements? The nature of threat narration is a 2-step process of storytelling by influencers and media outlets. and interpretation by an audience. Simply put, threat comes to life through threat narratives, and this animation of this quantum threat is precisely where it is both simplified into manageable pieces, while at the same time it slithers away from the objective base position. I want to put this in graphs. So we had a steady increase of quantum computing papers over the time. This is from the quantum computing report that was published earlier this year. And I tried to get some data from Web of Science where I searched for the keyword quantum threat. So in papers, you have these keywords where you can put, and in these quantum computing publications with keywords quantum threat, and this also increased steadily over time. Interestingly here too, most of the funding bodies for the papers with keyword quantum threat were from China. So Chinese funding agencies that funded the papers with this keyword. And if we look at Google Books Ngram Viewer, if you search for the quantum threat and quantum factorization, which is the premise, next we'll get into it, the premise behind the quantum threat, the actual narration has overcome the actual premise. So Shor or Grover for search, there's no feasible realization in sight. So Shor, so quantum factorization in itself, the premise behind it is less interesting. We can attribute this to the quantum computing supremacy race between China and the US. This is also well reflected in the policies behind it, and it's not about a threat in terms of a security threat, but a quantum race is so far just an economical one. This funding needs to come from somewhere. With the steady increase in the papers, we have a steady increase in startups, and the threat narrative helps them get funding. In a way, it also hurts viable quantum computing startups in doing proper work. Without further ado, let's look at the premises themselves. So we look at RSA attack types. Above all, here we're talking about loss of confidentiality. What I mean with RSA, it's the key exchange with public and private key. Think of TLS, SSL, or certificate authorities. Here we need sufficiently random and large prime numbers as a first step, as the RSA scheme relies on the hardness of factoring. That's why the factoring part is huge so far. And there are 3 attack types. We want to focus on the one that we're facing here. So it's factorization. It's a fast way, with Shor, the algorithm of Shor, there's a fast way of finding a period of a known period function. So it's not brute forcing through every key you find, but it's similar what you find in making transformations and then using the fast Fourier transform to in audio signals to find a peak. So it's easier to find, but very simplified. What you want to get away with, what I want to take away with this is here we already have the classical part encountered, only a small part of it. This is a hybrid algorithm. Shor is mostly classical, so 3 steps in classical and 2 for a quantum computer. Another way, I want to stress that RSA's technology in itself, like everything else in use, it had some vulnerabilities, and it was mainly due to lack of randomness. So we had instances where IoT devices or firewalls were using these to actually generate those keys. They were using either an already pre-configured IP address, or they didn't have enough compute power to compute large enough primes, so they became susceptible to it. What I mean with lack of randomness is we have a lot of pseudo-random number generators that try to produce numbers randomly, but because they're in a computer and the pseudo-random they do it through algorithms. Then there's true random number generators that use entropy, be it heat fluctuations in atmospheric pressure or just fluctuations in temperature to produce these numbers. And quantum random number generators actually use quantum properties to have true random numbers. Could also, a true random number generator could also be a radioactive source that you're pointing at. And we need these random seeds, and at the same time we need padding, so you can't guess what you're looking at encrypted. There will be encrypted gibberish, but you would know if it's an email because you know it starts with a hi and then something else, so you can deduce there's a hello or hi, and that's why you need padding, so we don't have just a gibberish email in the same format, but you would not know if that's an email or not. For now, the highest RSA key factor was 829 binary digits in 2020, and that was RSA 2050. It took months and significant cost on a classical device, supercomputer, several devices. The question here is, who has the money and the resources to do that, and for what purpose? We also have to gloss over Grover. This is an algorithm that uses superposition and interference to highlight a special state that we care about. So amplitude amplification. Initially, it was designed for dictionary search, and before we can do any feasible Grover, there will be Shor implementations because it needs sufficiently large sufficiently large QPUs, and it relies on QROM, so quantum random access memory that doesn't exist yet. And 256-bit AES is still secure against all known attacks so far. It's not just AES, it's also the SHA family. And there's no better algorithm on a classical computer for finding a key used in AES than to simply try each key until the correct one is found. To stress this, and why we can't use the NIST devices this is because there are no close guesses when one bit is off, and meaning we can't find the correct key. With current devices, this is so far from being a reality that most things do not exist to constitute even a theoretical exploit. I want to quickly skim over the algorithmic resource estimates as well, especially for Grover. There were about 4,719 qubits that we need for 521 bits, and simulated results, and 10 to the power of 12 Toffoli gates. These are controlled NOT gates. They need QROM here again, and there are way more qubits and gates needed, introducing way more noise. There must be some elaborate error correction for this to substantiate some sort of threat in maybe 20 years, who knows. Another one would be from Craig Gidney at Google, that you can do that in 8 hours with 20 million noisy qubits. And also another one that I want to highlight is that in 177 days and 13,000 logical qubits, again with quantum random, so QROM and multimode memory, that would be possible. And this is good work. These are good advancements in algorithm research, but it's still far from being utilized. Maybe some 20 years. Because utilization looks like this. We had some instances where high numbers were factored, or they claimed they factored them. However, these have been with prior knowledge, and IBM had to publish these papers that quantum factoring has been oversimplified and pretending to factor large numbers, as in they have known a factor before. So instead of actually factorizing the whole number without prior knowledge, they already knew a prime and then tried to find the other. That is trivial for classical as well. And the actual experimentation, and some have reproduced it and also could only do that for 21, so n equals 21. This highlights it clearly that they failed at factoring 35. So do we need patching? Do we need to patch everything all now? Otherwise privacy ends for us all now. And I mean, we have been looking at peer-reviewed, reproduced and tested papers in the science community. Well, for me, my common sense is tingling. And just yesterday, and this was published 5 days ago, a Chinese outlet came up with being able to factor a 48-bit number with 10 qubits. And they suppose they can factor RSA 2084, 48 with 372 qubits. The scaling there is questionable. It's not peer-reviewed. This is a preprint. So it would also render lattice-based PQC vulnerable. Yet their experimental performance is weird. The graphs are inconsistent with the results that they claim. And that goes back to my common sense. Again, this is a preprint, so we have to test it. It has to go through peer review, and it has to be tried to be reproduced. But there are a lot of fishy claims that can get inflated up until there is some peer review. And the interesting part here is this is also one of these funding bodies. So these three, there were more universities, but these three universities also come up high in the list for the quantum threat. Weirdly, they started pushing out a lot of papers, dozens in a matter of months, which is also already fishy. So the question is if they're also using this strategy to milk funding from the Chinese government because they couldn't deliver overstated, inflated promises. And here again, this is a preprint. This is not peer-reviewed, so scientists have not looked over this. This has to be reproduced and looked at. Yet this would be a good exercise, and we'll give this a benefit of the doubt until it's proven otherwise, and include it in our thought experiments. If that might be true, despite unlikely, again, it needs to be checked. The problem of overstatements and promises that do not hold here in the whole narrative, it's clear. There's a lot of money behind it. There's a lot of pressure behind the funding bodies because they can't distinguish between what is technically correct and what is overstated. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any funding. There should be funding, just not for the mere mention of a quantum threat, and it should address the actual problem. And how can we make sure the right things get money? As always, we have to assess it. And if we are not looking at classified data that has, intelligence life over 20 to 30 years to store before decryption methods and quantum computers become threats, like nuclear bomb storage sites, we will probably only take peer-reviewed scientific output into account and verge over to the catastrophic claims. And with this two things in mind, the imminent quantum threat for all and everything is not given. There are other low-hanging fruit. That's also a statement for me, but don't take my word for it. Let's look at how we can estimate the risk and what attack vectors may look like together. And first, I want to introduce a methodology to estimate the risk. I chose OWASP risk rating. The OWASP risk rating methodology is a qualitative one of several ones. And here, we should also note if it's not, you can extend it. This is not for everyone. This is not just a template that can't be adjusted. If you're, for example, in a military company, you might want to include loss of life. If you're from an ICS company, so industrial control systems are heavily used there, you might want to include safety. And how you compute this is you go over threat agent factors and vulnerability factors, which constitute the likelihood, and technical and business impact, which is the impact overall. And the likelihood times the impact equals to the severity, as you can see here. We have now gone over a lot of prerequisites, and as I said, with the quantum threat, loss of confidentiality, the factoring of RSA is first and foremost there. So that would be one of the parts it would actually affect highly in the rating. And another one would be the ease of exploit. So depending how much noise we have, how good the fidelities are, and how well we calibrate those things and have well error correction, the ease of exploit becomes easier. And of course, if there's better algorithms that need less qubits, that would affect that risk rating as well. Also, to make it a little bit more clear, or to bring it into the perspective of a cybersecurity professional, I tried to map what a quantum attack may look like in the micro attack enterprise. What I could find is that in this example, there's not much. I mean, again, there's so many TTPs, but one thing is often overlooked, and that's the supply chain compromise. This is not primarily something that is a quantum attack. This is quite classical. We just take the analogy of the RSA secure ID breach. What I want to highlight here is this is not what attacker would use in this quantum threat scenario, but it would constitute, in my opinion, part of it. So this is greened out. If we use quantum as a service to generate keys, but they get breached, or there's a backdoor, and well, bad for us. But the actual quantum threat, so the premise behind it that we hear in the news, that there's factoring, there's harvest now, decrypt later, etc., there's brute forcing, this is not quite specifically brute force with everything. This is, for example, Grover with the dictionary search, where we go through everything and can do then password cracking if we had Qron. In some sort of way, more elegant brute force cracking would be sure in some way, but are saying this sense. Then again, if we look at command and control, it's not just to actually break, but there are more instances that I could find where I could map this to an adversary using this for their own channels, maybe not just in terms of the quantum threat and QKD, but use PQC themselves, or just use or 3 qubits to encrypt their channels with certain random numbers. So encrypted channels or non-standard encodings. And at the same time, they could use it for impact and use a quantum algorithm or a PQC algorithm, or a hybrid one, to encrypt the data for impact. And of course, it has more threat scenarios and threat vectors than that, but these are the 3 that are highly mentioned. The one that I mentioned is the supply chain compromise. Again, what I said, it's a classical one. I don't want to dwell too much on it, because there's just the notion of, if you use this as a supplier, they might get breached. That's the same problem. The one that we hear more in the news is the harvest now and decrypt later. I want to highlight here, this is untargeted. The harvest now is a classical man-in-the-middle attack, and this is untargeted. You just collect massive amounts of data, and governments have been rumored for years to be collecting that and storing other nations' encrypted messages. They cannot crack now, with the hope of cracking them later with better compute power, supercomputers, or quantum computers. An example would be overseas cables, as with the Snowden affair in Frankfurt, for example, the DKIX was offered by the BND to be accessed by the NSA. There have been rumors about backdoors in firewalls and etc. I don't want to get too much into this. We might be confronted with client-side scanning soon too, and I hope companies that thought harvest now decrypt later is a problem in some way also implemented dedicated lines already. So not just dedicated lines, but also the security concepts behind it. So they thought about the physical security to protect the dedicated line physically, and in some way harvest now and decrypt later, there's massive amounts of data that you would harvest, and just looking and thinking about the cost of decryption of classical, by classical means with RSA or quantum computers, it takes a huge amount of time and a huge amount of money and the workforce to educate to be able to do this. And the last attack that we also know of and hear of is offline cracking. This one is different. It's not untargeted and just heavy amount of data being accumulated, but it's targeted. Sometimes they mean they dump credentials and then crack them offline. This is very unlikely. I don't think 20 years is an intelligence lifetime of a password. I can be proven wrong, but there must be something wrong if there's a password that relies to be 20 years there. And that's quite hypothetical. What's more likely are documents, that there are some highly classified documents that need to have that have an intelligence lifetime of 20, 30 years or more. And that usually constitutes of capabilities of someone who can store all of this with untargeted the massive amount of data that costs in storage for these many years. These are activities for nation states. It's nation state level activities. You need huge amount of time, you need huge amount of resources, money, and people to decrypt it. So this is not opportunistic, and it boils down to that the threat is not ubiquitously relevant, but to everyone and everything, but precisely to nation state level agencies, institutions, maybe contractors. So this isn't as relevant as it claims, but what are the actual attack vectors? Possible attacks using quantum technologies. I've tried to map some by using SANS posters. So network penetration testing scenarios. Here we can see one poster where I want to highlight how a man-in-the-middle attack might look like, where an adversary might try to get massive amounts of data from a router. And if we're honest, how likely is that a company, or in this case a company, someone will just leech off the data from the router, which can be terabytes of data in a day, and if longer, petabytes, who knows? They have to store it. They don't know which packet has which important document or has any important information in it. That's quite unlikely. So, and to do anything meaningful with data, it needs to be unencrypted somewhere. So rather than the router, why would they not move somewhere else? And if the person, if it were not just a harvest now decrypt later, but something targeted, when they need to know where and when to harvest, they probably have other means and know where to get it unencrypted. The other one is the offline cracking, where you would have a targeted attack, but you only dump the credentials or documents that might, again, be different, but storing the credentials for 20 years and decrypt them later makes no sense. With documents, that makes a little bit more sense. Again, to put this in relation, what does your company have on intelligence lifetime of data that has a 20-year lifetime? Usually maybe 3 years, 1 year, maybe less, but 20 is unusual. And then again, they can't be serious by suggesting that just because RSA is theoretically possible to be vulnerable or attacked by this. It's thinking about the massive amounts of data, decryption time, the money that would be behind decrypting browser sessions of some persons is just highly unlikely. And I want to stress again, usually if someone knows how to steal target encrypted data and store it for 20 years to decrypt it, they probably know where to get it unencrypted or have more money and resources to actually try something else in that lifetime. So there are some common sense mitigations, as you've seen. or I've teasered with the Jay Tibbetts paper. Again, with the supply chain compromise, I don't want to get too much into depth. Just use zero trust, trust no one, verify everyone. The harvest now or decrypt later. They said you might have already the scenarios of a dedicated line, where you already also have physical security and security concept you thought about the middle and the man in the middle attacks, and are already prepared after what you've seen with DKIG, Snowden, and backdoors. Then DLP, data leakage or data loss prevention, could also be used as a mitigation, so you know when something has been harvested or not. And with offline cracking, either in enterprise, you have usually Windows systems use credential guard, so your creds are not cached, or remote credential cards, remote credential guard. So if you have if you RDP, they're also not cached. Then when you have classified data, or if we play devil's advocate with the Chinese paper that RSA is next year already vulnerable, then you have to look at your classified data and triage the crypto protocol. So what type of data do I need to protect? Because we can't just double the RSA key with a finger snip. Some companies might, but the plethora of them might not. And that's a good point, to quickly be able to know where your crown jewels are, to know where you're classified, what your crown data is in some way. If something happens, the risk suddenly gets higher, or some vulnerabilities out there. A triage is probably the way to patch first and then roll out stuff later. In another way, you could also, instead of PQC or QKD, just use triple DES for documents, or triple AES has also been hypothesized that would work and make things more secure beyond 30 years. Doesn't want to move. There we go. Again, iterated, if someone knows how to steal encrypted data and store it for a long time, they know how to get it unencrypted. And this is also a selling argument for quantum key distribution, so not the quantum threat, but the quantum advantage in quantum communication. And as I earlier hinted upon, why QKD might not be necessary, even if you decrypt RSA 20 years later with a packet that you had targeted and knew that this document was there, but it has a 3-DES encrypted file, or a 3 times applied AES encryption on that file, you cannot decrypt it. And with QKD, you know if your packets or your data has been intercepted. So some time of eavesdropper detection. And for that, it doesn't add any security. It rivals DLP at best. So the security is not better, as in if something gets decrypted, but your actual target you can't decrypt, it's the same as, yeah, you know there's an eavesdropper, but he can't decrypt it either. So the security level is the same. And if anything, components like quantum random number generators, here you can see ID Quantique, there are more than ID Quantique out there, but it's a good example how a quantum technology that is mature has found its market. You can find the chips in Samsung phones now, for example. New Samsung phones have ID Quantique chips for the random number generation. Then there are some components and mathematical concepts that are useful to find new ciphers. This is a paper from Contrappi. It's something like hybrid QKD, but the transmission is on copper cables, so you have shorter keys with the same security level because they're using a different type of algorithm. This is interesting, as in you have shorter keys with the same security level of one that has a longer bit length. So with the shorter bit length, you can retrofit systems that don't have as much compute power. This is not quite PQC, but it runs a similar logic. just about difficult math schemes that a quantum computer may not be able to break. But with the hybrid ones that you use a quantum computer or quantum technologies in the first step to generate it. Again, I have to talk about post-quantum cryptography. I'll go with it into a bit more depth later. These are classical concepts that that are supposedly quantum secure. I've been talking about the risk rating for some time, and I wanted to give the threat narrative the benefit of the doubt, and I wanted to empathize with the drivers of PQC, for example. Google is one of the drivers of PQC, and from the viewpoint of that company, I wanted to give you a risk rating. But first, you see a horrible clickbait title, but the blog post is quite sobering, where they're talking about crypto agility. And they use their application layer transports, so ALTS, that's a mutual authentication transport encryption system only for Google. It's like a special TLS, just that they for their containerization invented, and on top of them they used for their they use it for the RPC communication for the Google infrastructure and the containerization, and they usually have 3 keys, and one key on one key that is ephemeral they used MTRU HRSS for key encapsulation. Read it up if you want to. This is a bit complicated. In the sense, I want to show that when you compare why they use this as their crypto agility exercise, on this side you can see RSA and ECC, the likelihood of this being broken, the impact that it would have on the company. And for Google, of course, this would be high because they are driving PQC, and that being breached could have a technical impact. So in their view, being breached as a government contractor in the same way might have a lot of impact. And again, this is my rating that I've looked at. I looked at the ease of exploit and the technical impact, attack complexity based on previously rated remote procedure call vulnerabilities, TLS vulnerabilities, key compromise impersonation vulnerabilities, and X509 ones, CVE specifically. And staying in the frame, there's not absolute quantification. This is quite subjective, but the likelihood that a threat agent and vulnerability factors diminish they've diminished by security through obscurity. And what I mean is that the likelihood here gets smaller and smaller because less adversaries are able to grasp the concepts or have the manpower or have the resources to time resources, and the target technology is too difficult. In a way, the impact reduces because they're more compliant. So the risk severity in view of the benefit of the doubt diminishes. But most companies, this is a McKinsey study, most companies, in terms of 70% that they have been asked, they asked 114 companies, they have to build up their fundamental security controls, and crypto agility is not their biggest topic or pain, looking at their overall security posture. So crypto agility is also a driver in the media for NIST and the PQC adoption, and they do use some unreasonable generalizations, as we have seen, that albeit this is a good idea and necessary work, there's an overstated threat. I want to highlight too that post-quantum cryptography, there will be winners they already have been announced winners, but they will roll out standardization documents by 2024. But what is unnerving to me is that before they announced them, one of their winners' SIG has been broken in an hour on a single core, and Rainbow also has been broken on a weekend. So these are two that have been right before the winner was announced, been broken. This is unnerving, and at the same time, PQC needs a lot of compute power. So if we look at, ICS environments and they use field bus, there's no way that we'll have that there. And key cycling has a high cost and gain for companies that might not be having a lot of resources, time, money, and the need for it. And another thing, as Roy is unable to trust government proximity. So NIST is close to government agencies, contractors, and institutions, and like Roy, instead of blind trust, a zero trust approach might be healthier, where nation-state level security recommendations are taken with a grain of salt, or if relevant to one at all. And here again, I'm thinking about the sea cable, Snowden, etc. So if we're shifting the risk profiles in reality, and now we have companies that do not have, that are not mature enough to have a high crypto agility, well, you can't quickly change your crypto or anything, and then suddenly you have a public exploit that a researcher in crypto is publishing on PQC, then my threat here becomes higher. This also reflects that if you use quantum computing, I'll quickly finish up. Sorry. This also reflects that quantum computing will not significantly reduce or enhance the inherent utility of cryptography, because the outcome of the quantum supremacy race is fundamentally an economical one. So we're looking more on, if you want to rate a company that has nation-state proximity, this might be different, but it depends on the intelligence lifetime of your data, the compliance policy regulations for the point in time. I want you to consider where you have important data, how it can be accessed, could you detect exfiltration, how's the lifespan of the data, and who is interested in it, and what capabilities would they have. Again, with the risk rating, non-compliance is important, loss of confidentiality when you look at quantum threats, the ease of exploit when the resources change, and threat agent factors if something changes and the access of the resources or there's more of them. Wrapping it up, so the changes in qubit quality and error correction schemes is what you should look out for to adjust your risk rating. The QRAM or resource advancements, algorithmic advances or policy change. So when you hear things in the news, so the quantum threat the quantum narrative doesn't overstate the premise of your risk rating. I want you to assess your own risk, know your critical data, know your critical assets, assess your risks corresponding to it, and if changes occur, adjust the risk and fix them. So constantly changing the conceptions of this must be true, it comes from an authority, is also a powerful antidote. So there's no passive acceptance of threat narration and inflation. Challenging those conventions is powerful in the quest for actual objective threats for one own company, and casting away the blind acceptance of false threat narratives. So my last remarks are on the threat that the quantum race is predominantly an economical one. The threat is situated in fundamental research, far from an immediate impact generalized for everyone and everything. It's not ending privacy for all, it's not black and white. And as individuals, I don't think anyone would violate your privacy for millions of dollars, storing it for decades, educating a workforce, spending millions to decrypt it en masse when one gives it away for free on social media, or phishing is still cheap and fruitful. The intelligence lifetime of classified data can be stored for a long time. If you're a government contractor, this might be different and may be driven through policies, so the risk rating might look different for you again. And please assess your own risks according to your own needs and your own capabilities. I want to hear your thoughts and questions. Sorry for overtaking and taking too long. I'm sorry, I had more to say than I thought.
Yeah, well, no problem. I think that sounds really reasonable. Think for yourself and do your own risk assessment. Don't bite into the headlines. I would imagine there are thousands of questions, and even with not that many people in the audience. Anyone want to be special? Go for a question. Nobody? Okay. Oh yeah, okay. Say it, Thomas. Sorry? The global effort in 2022 is listed at $30 billion. And
half of it is coming from China.
Half of it is from China.
Should we worry?
Should we worry?
It depends what you're worried about. I mean, if you want to have more funding than China, maybe. But as you've seen with the one paper that I shown you, the preprint, they're fooling their own government to get more funding. And they're achieving it. So I don't want to fool my government with having, or European Western countries to give money for something that isn't fruitful or useful, because the paper, it's an assumption, as I've skimmed it, is not very fruitful, and there's a lot of output there. There should be a lot of funding, but I don't think just throwing money at a topic is enough. You need to have directed policies, and you have to have certain funding agencies that know what they're funding, and not just for the fun of it.
Good answer. All right, let's give her another applause, shall we? Thank you. Thank you, Natalie. We'll speak.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.